At that lit-up stage, at the peak of what I thought would be the happiest day of my life, the mended shoe I wore with pride finally came apart. It wasn't the sound of the sole detaching that humiliated me, but the muffled laughter that came from my daughter-in-law, Barbara, and her daughter, Holly. A cold, sharp laugh that echoed in the silence of that auditorium and pierced my chest like a knife. They weren't laughing at the shoe, but at me, at my poverty, at the whole lifetime of sacrifices had sewn together so that my grandson, my Ethan, could shine. The shoe, which had accompanied me for decades, suddenly betrayed me, and the tears I tried to hold back, out of pride, mixed with the shame as I felt my grandson's gaze, so full of compassion. Barbara muttered something about poverty that can't be hidden, but the venom in her voice said so much more. She and her daughter looked down on me, as if my entire life, the life I dedicated to them, was nothing more than a tasteless joke. And the pain wasn't just mine. It was the pain of a silent effort, of every penny saved, of every hand-sewn patch so that my Ethan could have the future he deserved. In the middle of that hall, with people passing by and the sound of the graduation ceremony echoing, I understood that this wasn't just a laugh of contempt. It was the omen of something much bigger, a conflict I never imagined existed, but which now, with my dignity in tatters, revealed itself as so real. It was as if that shoe, the tip of an iceberg, and the humiliation I felt was only the first sign of a betrayal that would follow. But would the woman who was a laughingstock on the stage of her grandson's life be able somehow to turn the tables? If my story, the story of the widow Eleanor, touches your heart, follow me to the end. And if you want to continue to hear real stories like this, subscribe and share. Maybe the next story will be yours or someone you know. My name is Eleanor Miller. I'm 78 years old. The truth is, I've always lived with very little. Since I was 16, the sewing machine has been an extension of my hands. The constant hum of the pedal, the smell of the hot iron, and the rough feel of the fabrics became the rhythm of my days. I never needed much, just honesty in my work and the presence of my grandson Ethan, whom I raised like a son. A widow since I was 56, I learned not to expect help from anyone. Only my own discipline and the small joys of life, like hearing the bell of London's Big Ben chiming through the busy streets. On the morning of his graduation, I woke up before the sun rose. I made my coffee, strong as ever, and let the toast brown until the smell spread through the small kitchen. As I buttered the slice, I looked at the pair of shoes next to the chair, black, old, but shined as best I could. I had already patched the sole myself twice. They'll hold up just one more day, I murmured to myself, not imagining that they would be the very ones to expose me. I put on my best navy blue dress, the one I saved for important occasions. The fabric already showed signs of wear, but it still had dignity. I tied my hair in a simple bun, spritzed a drop of the cheap perfume I got from my friend Martha for Christmas, and waited for Ethan to come pick me up. He arrived smiling with his gown in his hand. Pride filled my chest, almost muffling the cold of the morning. "Grandma, you look beautiful," he said, and those 3 words were my comfort before what. When we entered the university auditorium, I immediately felt my daughter-in-law Barbara's gaze scanning me from head to toe. Her expensive, sickly sweet perfume mixed with the smell of flowers in the lobby. It was during the ceremony that it happened. In the silence between 2 speeches, I heard a snap. The sole of my shoe gave way and came off completely. The dry sound echoed in my ears more than in the room. And then the muffled laughter, first from Barbara, then from her daughter, Holly. "Look at that," The old lady doesn't even have decent shoes, Holly whispered, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. Blood rushed to my face. My throat felt dry. My hands trembled in my lap. I remained motionless as if I hadn't heard. Ethan looked at me with teary eyes, and that look of compassion hurt more than their laughter. I wanted him to see me as strong, but in that instant it seemed that my whole life of sacrifices was summed up in a torn shoe. The smell on the newly painted auditorium wall mixed with the heavy atmosphere. I tried to fix my eyes on the stage where they were calling the graduates' names, but the phrase hammered inside me. Doesn't even have decent shoes. How many clothes had I sewn for Barbara? How many times had I adjusted the hem of one of her dresses without charging a single cent? And now, in front of everyone, I was reduced to an object of scorn. My heart was pounding, as if every muffled laugh was a needle piercing my chest. I thought about getting up and leaving, but the fear of ruining Ethan's day kept me seated. I discreetly ran my hand over the loose sole, trying to fix it with my fingertips, as if it were possible to glue dignity back on in that instant. Ethan whispered, "Grandma, don't pay attention. Please don't pay attention." But how could I not pay attention if the wound was already open? I took a deep breath, closed my eyes for an instant, and promised myself I wouldn't give them the show of seeing me cry. I stayed there, rigid, until the end of the ceremony. The university bell rang when the students threw their caps into the air, but the sound that remained etched in my memory wasn't the applause, but the muffled laughter of Barbara. I didn't know it yet, but that torn shoe was just the first snap of a much bigger crack. At the end of the ceremony, the London sun reflected on the cobblestone pavement and blinded me for a moment. I walked slowly, dragging my foot with the shoeless sole, trying to hide the defect, but each step seemed to shout louder than my own voice. The smell of roasted chestnuts from the corner brought me back to reality, but it was soon muffled by the sound of Barbara's and Holly's laughter behind me. I heard Holly say in a mocking tone, "If I'd known she'd show up like this, I wouldn't have even come." My face burned, but I stayed firm, holding Ethan's arm. He tried to divert my attention, talking about the future, about his plans after graduation, but the shadow of humiliation had already settled in me. We arrived at the door of the restaurant where we would have the celebration lunch. The place was cozy, with stone walls and the smell of roasted cod in the air. However, for me, that environment felt like a prison. The happy conversations of the guests mixed with the clatter of silverware and the muffled sound of classical music playing softly on the radio. But everything sounded distant. Barbara pulled out a chair to sit across from me and flashed a smile that looked more like a personal victory. I avoided her eyes and adjusted my dress in my lap, trying not to show the loose sole of the shoe. Ethan, in his innocence, tried to lift the mood. He told stories from the university, about his friends, about the all-nighters studying. I smiled, but the taste of the grilled fish they served me seemed gray, bland. With every bite, I thought about how many extra sewing shifts I had done so he could have books, clothes, and even the very suit he was wearing at that moment. And yet, in front of everyone, I had been ridiculed. What more did I need to sacrifice to be respected? In a moment of silence, Barbara leaned into Holly and, in a low but audible voice, commented, "That's why I never took her to any company dinners. It would have been an embarrassment." The snap in my chest was so strong that I had to drink a sip of wine to disguise the trembling in my hands. Ethan heard it. I saw it in his eyes, bit his lips, and didn't say anything. That omission hurt almost as much as the words. I wanted him to defend me, but I understood he was trapped between his love for his grandmother and his fear of his mother. I spent the rest of the lunch in silence, moving the card around on my plate, feeling the strong smell of olive oil and garlic rise until I felt sick. Holly's laugh was piercing, cutting the air like a razor blade. Every time she looked at my feet, I knew she was talking about the shoe. Never had a pair of shoes seemed so heavy, so impossible to carry. I was already tired of being a laughingstock, but at that table, surrounded by people who claimed to be family, I realized that what hurt wasn't the torn shoe, but the indifference with which they treated a lifetime of sacrifice. When we finally left, the cold street air hit my face like a punch, and for an instant it was even a relief. The smell of rain announced that the afternoon would pour down, but that didn't matter much to me. Barbara walked ahead with Holly, talking loudly about trips and shopping. Ethan stayed behind with me, walking slowly. He just said, "Grandma, I'm sorry about today." I didn't answer, not because I had nothing to say, but because the words were jumbled between hurt and silence. We arrived at my building in the Covent Garden neighborhood, and each step of the stone stairs seemed steeper than usual. The echo of Ethan's steps behind me mixed with the creak of the old gate. When I entered the house, the familiar smell of lavender from my room brought me a brief sense of shelter, but it soon disappeared. Ethan hugged me, and I felt he wanted to apologize on behalf of the others, but it wasn't fair. It wasn't his fault for that wound. After he left, I sat alone in the living room, with the silent sewing machine beside me. I ran my fingers over the cold iron pedal, remembering how many nights I stayed up to pay for his school. The church clock struck the hours, and the sound echoed on the walls as if it were a cruel reminder. Time had passed, and yet I was seen as the poor old lady with the torn shoe. What I didn't know was that, in a few days, the same city that witnessed my humiliation would also be the stage for my silent revenge. The next morning, I woke up with the smell of coffee spreading through the kitchen and the timid light entering through the window. The images of the graduation still haunted me, as if every detail had been ironed into my mind. Holly's laugh, Barbara's venomous comment, Ethan's complicit silence, everything came back as if the scene were happening inside my own living room. I put my bare feet on the cold floor and, by instinct, looked for the shoes by the bed. They were there, with the sole dangling, like a cruel reminder of the shame. I picked them up in my hands and ran my finger over the worn stitching. For the first time in many years, I felt it was no longer worth it to mend them. I spent the day as usual. I tidied the house, did the laundry, prepared a simple lunch of rice, beans, and a piece of fish bought at the market. The radio crackled softly, playing an old folk program. However, every sound seemed distant, as if I were trapped in a bubble. The unexpected visit of Mrs. Peterson, the neighbor, brought a little comfort. She came in carrying the smell of fresh bread and said, "Eleanor, I heard about the graduation. How did it go?" For a moment, I thought about smiling and saying it had been beautiful, but the lump in my throat wouldn't let me. I just shook my head and changed the subject. I didn't want my pain to be spread by others. 2 days later, Ethan appeared at my door. He looked dejected. His eyes were sunken, his posture hunched. He brought wild flowers wrapped in a newspaper. The strong smell of damp earth invaded the room. "Grandma, I wanted to talk about what happened," he began, unable to look me directly in the eye. I put the flowers in an improvised vase, an old wine bottle, and replied, "We don't need to talk about that now, Ethan." He insisted, "But we do. That wasn't fair." His tone was one of pain, not indignation, and I realized that the weight of that afternoon was also on his shoulders. Even so, the silence between us remained heavy. He told me about his plans to look for work in London, about the interviews he had already scheduled. I listened, but my mind was elsewhere. In his absence, would I become even more vulnerable to Barbara's humiliations? Or maybe that distance was the opportunity for him to grow without carrying the shadow of the shame his family attributed to me. When he said goodbye, the hug was longer than usual, and I realized there was something he wasn't saying. The next day, I received a certified letter. The envelope had the stamp of a notary office in central London. The smell of new paper mixed with fresh ink gave me a shiver. I sat at the table before opening it. My hands were trembling, and for a moment I thought about leaving. The letter aside, but curiosity was stronger. Inside, a summons to appear at the notary office on a scheduled date related to an inheritance process. I was confused. I didn't have anyone close to me to leave me assets. Who could have remembered an old seamstress like me? I spent the next few days with that question hammering in my head. As I hemmed a pair of trousers for a neighbor, the repetitive sound of the needle piercing the fabric seemed to mark every doubt. At night, the church bell rang and found me awake, lying in the dark, imagining possibilities. Would it be a mistake? Or maybe some distant relative I no longer even remembered? The anxiety began to erode my sleep, but it also lit a spark. What if this inheritance had the power to turn the tables? When the day came, I wore my navy blue dress again, the same one from the graduation. There was a strange desire in me to confront destiny head-on, in the same outfit that had witnessed my shame. I put on a pair of shoes, borrowed from Mrs. Peterson, much more comfortable and intact, and walked out onto the narrow streets of London. The cold morning air brought the smell of freshly baked bread from the bakeries, and the damp stones of the ground slipped under my feet. With every step, my heart accelerated, as if I were on my way to something that would change not only my future, but also the way I saw myself. When I arrived at the notary office, the environment had a mixed smell of stored paper and polished wood. The high walls, the antique furniture, and the hollow sound of footsteps echoing in the corridor gave the place a solemn air. The clerk who greeted me called my name naturally, as if he had been expecting me. "Mrs. Miller, this room is for you, please." I entered slowly, feeling my heart pound against my chest. Inside, a lawyer with thin glasses was waiting for me, holding a leather folder. It was then that I heard the phrase that would change everything. "You are here to deal with the inheritance of 7 apartments in the historic city centre of London." For a moment, I thought I had heard wrong. The sound of the lawyer's words echoed in the room as if coming from very far away. 7 apartments. The word 7 stuck in my head as if it were impossible to believe. My stomach churned, and the strong smell of wood polish mixed with the dust from the files made me dizzy. I leaned my wrinkled hands on the table so as not to lose my balance. "Is there a mistake?" Voice lower than I would have liked. The lawyer opened the folder, took out stamped documents, and slid them to me. "No, Mrs. Miller, is all registered, a legitimate inheritance left in your name." I took the papers with trembling hands. The paper was rough, the ink still clear, and my full name was there, in letters that left no room for doubt. As I read, the lawyer explained that the former owner, a gentleman named Arthur Wilson, had no direct heirs and had decided to leave his assets who had, in some way, marked his life. I had only known him by sight, an occasional sewing client, a quiet man who would appear once in a while to get the hem of his trousers fixed. I never imagined he would keep my name somewhere in his memory. My heart was racing, but at the same time, a wave of fear ran through me. What did it mean for a simple woman with calloused hands to become the owner of 7 apartments? The room seemed to shrink around me, and the distant sound of a car on the Street outside was the only thing that brought me back. I signed the papers with the heavy pen they handed me. The tip scratched the paper, and with every letter of my name, I felt as if I were sewing a new life, thread by thread. I left the notary office with the folder under my arm, the physical weight almost less than the invisible weight of the news. The streets of London, with their uneven cobblestones and the smell of hot pastries coming from the bakeries, suddenly seemed different, as if they were looking at me with new eyes. I, who had been the target of laughter just days before because of a torn shoe, now held in my hands documents that could silence any mockery. But the feeling wasn't one of immediate triumph. It was a mixture of dizziness and disbelief, as if the ground could give way at any moment. At home, I sat at the table, placed the open folder in front of me, and stared at the red stamps as if they could tell me more than the words already said. I ran my fingers over the papers, feeling the rough texture, and wondered, how would this revelation change the way Barbara and Holly treated me? Would they swallow their laughter for good? Or would they try to get close, feigning an affection they never had? The wall clock marked the hours slowly, and each tick was a reminder that I had a choice to make. In the late afternoon, Ethan showed up. The smell of rain was on his clothes, and he came in bringing the cold dampness from the street. I told him the news, bluntly, without embellishment. "Ethan, we've inherited 7 apartments." He widened his eyes, dropped his backpack on the floor, and stammered, "7? But how, Grandma?" I told him about Mr. Wilson, about the notary office, and showed him the papers. He held the documents with firm hands, but his eyes welled up. "They're gonna go crazy when they find out." My chest tightened at that phrase. I knew who he was referring to, his mother, Barbara, and his half-sister Holly. Those two who had made my poverty a reason for mockery would now sniff out this wealth like wolves after meat. Fear and anger mixed inside me. Ethan noticed and held my hand. "Grandma, promise me you won't let them use you." His firmness gave me a thread of courage, but also a new doubt. How far was I willing to go to protect not only the assets but my dignity? That night, I couldn't sleep. The room was dark, but the open folder on the table seemed to shine like a flame. The soft smell of lavender that always calmed me wasn't enough. I silently repeated the words I heard at the notary office. 7 apartments. I got up, walked from one side to the other, the floorboards creaking under my bare feet. A question haunted me. Would this inheritance be a gift or a trap? And above all, how would I use it against the family that had humiliated me? The next morning, I woke up with heavy eyes, as if I had spent the whole night carrying bags of sand. The black coffee was getting cold in the mug, because I couldn't do more than take small sips. The folder with the documents remained open on the table, like a visitor who wouldn't leave. The smell of paper and ink seemed to have infiltrated the whole house. As I mechanically messed with the toast, I thought about Barbara and Holly. I knew I wouldn't be able to hide it for long. In small cities like London, news travels faster than the wind, and it didn't take long. In the early afternoon, I heard the sound of loud knocks on the iron gate. It was an impatient, almost aggressive rhythm. When I opened the door, I came face to face with Barbara, her eyes flashing, her breathing a little heavy. Holly was behind her, chewing gum, with the same mocking look as always. Barbara's overly sweet perfume invaded the hallway like a suffocating cloud. "So it's true?" she blurted out, without even saying good afternoon. 7 apartments, Mom? And you were going to hide this from us?" I stood still for a moment, leaning against the door, the feeling cold of the iron against my palm. I wasn't going to hide anything. I just needed time to understand, I replied, trying to keep my voice firm. Holly let out a short giggle that echoed down the narrow corridor. "Understand? What is there to understand, Grandma? Now we're going to live well, right? It was about time you thought about your real family." Her words, full of contempt, fell on me like stones. I invited them in, albeit against my will. The smell of mold in the hallway contrasted with their exaggerated perfume, and for a moment I felt ashamed of the simplicity of my house. They sat in the living room, and Barbara began to talk non-stop, as if she had already planned everything. "We can sell 3 apartments immediately, buy a better house for Ethan in London, maybe even invest in something. And of course, one stays with me and another with Holly. After all, we're family." Every word of hers was a stab disguised as a smile. I watched them, silent, while the wall clock seemed to turn faster than ever. With every sentence, I realized there was no genuine surprise, no joy for my unexpected fate. There was only hunger that erodes any affection. Holly, fiddling with her phone without looking at me, finished with, "At least now you won't be embarrassed with a torn shoe. You can buy as many as you want." It was at that moment that my heart pounded so hard I almost got up from the chair. Before I could answer, Ethan arrived. His face wore the expression of someone who already imagined the scene he would find. The sound of the door closing behind him silenced the room for a few seconds. "Mom, Holly, that's not how it's going to be," he said, his voice firm and sharp. But Barbara, without losing her breath, retorted, "You're still too young, Ethan. You don't understand how it works. This isn't about you deciding. It's about your grandmother finally giving us something in return." Those words, "giving us something in return," echoed inside me with a bitter taste. I saw myself in the reflection of the living room china cabinet, an old woman in a navy blue dress with wrinkles that carried years of work, looking at 2 women who never knew what sacrifice was. I felt a silent anger grow, not for the money, but for the audacity of treating my life as a bill to be paid. My palm was sweating and I had to rub it on my knees to calm down. I realized that instant was a turning point. It was no longer just about the apartments. It was about reclaiming the dignity they had tried to tear from me. The metallic sound of the church bell outside broke the silence, marking the hour. Barbara looked up, impatient, as if waiting for my immediate decision. Ethan, standing beside me, waited for me to take a stand. And I knew I could no longer postpone it. I took a deep breath, felt the bitter taste of iron in my mouth, and said, "You want to know what's going to happen? Then listen carefully, because it won't be the way you think." Barbara arched her eyebrows and crossed her arms as if expecting an immediate concession. The sweet scent of her perfume seemed to suffocate the air in the room. "Then just say it, Mom. What are you going to do? Don't tell me you're going to waste this opportunity to help us," she sneered, tapping her painted nails against the arm of the chair. Holly, still fiddling with her phone, looked up and added, "Don't make it complicated, Grandma. It's simple. Sell and divide. Everyone gets their share, and that's it." The naturalness with which she spoke, as if what was mine was already theirs, made my blood run cold. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Are you listening to what you're saying? You're talking as if my grandmother were a cash register. She doesn't owe you anything." Barbara turned to him with a frosty smile, the same one I've seen so many times when she wanted to humiliate someone in public. "Ethan, don't be ungrateful. Everything your grandmother has is because of us. Who do you think took care of her when your grandfather died? I did. Who held down the fort when she was sick? I did." The words came out sharp, but inside me echoed the memory of all the times I fought alone without even getting a phone call from her. My throat burned, but I took a deep breath before speaking. "Barbara, you don't know half of the nights I spent sewing so Ethan would have something to eat. You don't know how many times I sold my own clothes to buy his books. I never asked you for anything, and now you show up to collect a debt that doesn't exist." The silence fell heavily, only interrupted by the ticking of the clock. Holly huffed, impatient, and said, "Then what's money for, if not for family? Are you going to let it rot in old properties?" Her words were like a slap, but at the same time they awakened something in me. I got up slowly, feeling the chair creak against the wooden floor, and walked to the china cabinet. The reflection showed me a tired woman, but not a defeated one. I opened the bottom drawer and took out a smaller folder where I had already started to organize documents since the day at the notary office. I placed it on the table with enough force for the dry sound to make the two of them jump. "The money will be used, yes, but not in the way you imagine." Barbara leaned forward, her eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening me, Mom?" Her voice came out full of irony, but there was an undertone of unease that didn't go unnoticed. Holly looked alternately at me and Ethan, as if she wanted to gauge the terrain before attacking. I opened the folder and slid some papers out, letting the official stamps show. The smell of fresh ink still permeated the documents. "Here's what's going to happen. And no, it's not the division you already planned between laughs." The following silence was almost unbearable. Ethan remained by my side, his hand on my shoulder, firm as I faced the two of them. Inside, my hands were sweating, my heart was pounding, but my voice came out surprisingly clear. "None of these apartments will be sold to sustain luxuries. They will be used to guarantee Ethan's future, because he was the only one who never turned his back on me. As for you," I paused, watching Barbara's face harden. "You will have no right to anything as long as I am alive." Barbara exploded, standing up abruptly. The chair scraped loudly across the floor. "Are you crazy, old woman? After everything, are you going to disinherit us in life? Are you going to get revenge on your own family?" Her scream reverberated through the narrow walls, and Holly dropped her phone, her eyes wide. I felt a chill run down my back, but I didn't back down. It was the first time in many years that I allowed myself to face my daughter without looking down. "It's not humiliation, it's justice," I replied. "And if it hurts you to hear this, imagine how it hurt me to be ridiculed in front of everyone." Holly tried to intervene, voice choked. "Grandma, it doesn't have to be like this. We just want to help." But the phrase came out weak, without conviction. Her look betrayed more fear of losing than a desire to help. Ethan, in turn, raised his chin and added, "She's not alone. I'll make sure this decision is respected." The weight of those words brought a wave of warmth to my chest. For the first time, I didn't feel like just a tired old woman. I felt like the owner of my own story. The church bell rang again, marking the top of the hour, and I realized how that sound resonated differently now. It was no longer just a reminder of the passage of time, it was the announcement of a new beginning. The two of them stared at me, astonished, as if they didn't recognize the woman in front of them. Maybe they didn't, because I was also discovering this new version of myself. And in that instant, I understood that for the first time, the weight wasn't in the shoes I wore, but in the firmness with which I stood my ground. Barbara stood in the middle of the room, taking a deep breath as if searching for words sharper than knives. Her face was red, and the shine in her eyes was not from tears, but from contained rage. "So that's it? After everything, you're going to disown us in life? You're going to get revenge on your own family?" she asked, her voice trembling with fury. The silence that followed was only interrupted by the distant sound of a pot falling in the neighboring apartment. I stared at her, firm, with the feeling that the hierarchy was finally being reversed. It was no longer me shrinking before her, but she who was squirming before my decision. Holly, still sitting, seemed not to know whether she should support her mother or try a more gentle approach. She ran her hands through her straight hair, the smell of hairspray still strong, and looked at me as if she were measuring a minefield. "Grandma, maybe you're hurt, but we're family. You can't just erase that." Her tone was almost sweet, but behind it was an urgency that betrayed the true motive: fear of losing what was never hers. Ethan huffed, crossing his arms, and said, "Family isn't just a word said when it's convenient, it's presence. And you two were never there." Ethan's words echoed in the room like thunder. I felt my eyes well up, but I didn't cry. Barbara, however, turned against him with violence. "Shut up. You don't know anything about life. If it weren't for me, you wouldn't have even gotten to university." Ethan laughed nervously, a short, joyless laugh, and replied, "If it weren't for her, Mom, I wouldn't have gotten anywhere. It was my grandmother who held me up through every fall, every difficulty. You never saw it because you never wanted to see it." The tension made the air in the room dense, almost unbreathable. I could feel the sweat running down my back, despite the cold coming through the window cracks. Every breath seemed like an effort, every word a battle. Approached the table, Barbara rested her hands on the documents, and said in a threatening tone, "It may all be in your name now, but it won't stay that way. I'm going to find a lawyer. This isn't fair." The smell of her nail polish mixed with her perfume made me feel sick. I pulled the papers close to me with the calmness of someone who is putting away a newly sewn garment and replied, "You can find whomever you want. The law also knows how to recognize who has value." Her look turned into a mixture of disdain and disbelief. "You've changed, Mom. You've become a bitter, rancorous old woman," she said, trying to hurt me where she thought I was most vulnerable. But for the first time, those words didn't affect me. It was as if every insult were a thread breaking, freeing me from an old stitch that bound me to her. I just took a deep breath and said, "I'm not bitter. I'm free. There's a difference you never understood." Holly, realizing her mother no longer had control of the situation, got up slowly. The sound of her thin heel hitting the floor echoed dryly. She tried one more time. "Grandma, there's still time to reconsider. You don't have to cut us off like this. We can be together, finally." The tone was rehearsed, almost theatrical, but her eyes didn't hide the frustration. I just smiled faintly, a tired smile, and replied, "Being truly together would have meant respecting me when I had nothing. Now it's too late." Ethan placed his hand on my shoulder again, firm as an anchor. "Grandma, you don't need to get worked up anymore. They've already understood." Barbara huffed, grabbed her purse with a brusque gesture, and headed for the door, followed by Holly. The sound of their heels moving away down the hallway was the sound of a cycle closing. I stood in the living room, my heart still racing, but for the first time in a long time, feeling that every beat belonged to me and not to the expectations of others. When the door closed behind them, silence took over the house. It was a different kind of silence, not heavy but liberating. The smell of old wood and lavender reasserted itself, as if the space was finally breathing with me. I sat down slowly, with Ethan by my side, and I realized that the folder of documents no longer seemed so intimidating. It was just a symbol. The real weight had dissolved with that door closing, and I knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of something much bigger. After Barbara and Holly had left, I sat in the armchair in the living room, watching the shadows that the yellowish streetlight projected through the window cracks. The clock was ticking, and the distant sound of a car passing on the street seemed louder than normal. My heart hadn't completely calmed down yet. It beat in irregular rhythms, reminding me of every word said hours before. Ethan made chamomile tea, and handed it to me in silence. The soft aroma filled the air, but even that familiar smell couldn't muffle the feeling that a bigger storm was still to come. I went to bed late, but sleep wouldn't come. I stared at the ceiling where small cracks drew lines that looked like maps of lives that had already broken. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my daughter's face distorted by anger, and her voice echoed in my head. "I'm going to find a lawyer." That threat wouldn't leave my mind. I knew she was capable of following through, not out of need, but out of a simple desire to control me, to show that she still had some power over me. The next day, I woke up with swollen eyes, but determined not to back down. I prepared my coffee, the strong smell filling the kitchen, and placed a new towel on the table, as if small gestures could reinforce the idea that a new cycle was beginning. Ethan arrived early, worried, and asked if I was okay. I replied that I was, but the truth was that there was a restlessness throbbing inside me, as if every corner of the house held the expectation of Barbara's next attack. It didn't take long for the phone to ring. The shrill sound broke the morning silence and made my heart race. I answered with a trembling hand. It was Barbara. Her voice was controlled, almost sweet, but I recognized the poison behind every word. "Mom, we don't have to fight. I thought about it more and I think we can reach an agreement. Let's schedule a time to talk, just the two of us." As she spoke, I looked at the sewing machine in the corner of the room, silent, as if it were an old friend reminding me not to give in. I just replied, "No, Barbara, there's no agreement. I've already decided." On the other end of the line, I heard a heavy sigh, followed by a charged silence. Then came the dry phrase that chilled my blood. "If that's what you want, I won't be responsible for what happens." And she hung up. I stood still with the phone in my hand, feeling the sweat running down my palm. The noise of the neighbors in the hallway seemed distant, muffled, as if the world around me had lost its sharpness. Only her warning echoed inside me, and I knew I had to prepare for what was to come. Ethan came into the room shortly after and saw my pale face. He asked what had happened, and I told him everything. He clenched his fists, his face filled with a mixture of anger and fear. "Grandma, she's not going to stop, but we're not going to back down either. If she tries something, we'll respond in kind." His firmness was a balm, but it also worried me. I knew what Barbara was capable of, and I didn't want Ethan to get burned in this war. Still, inside me, a spark lit up. Maybe it was time to show her that I was no longer the silent woman who accepted everything in silence. I spent the rest of the day on high alert, listening to every sound with double attention. The banging of a door in the building, the dragging of furniture in the upstairs apartment, even the meow of a cat in the street made me jump. At night, I sat down with Ethan for dinner, and as the smell of vegetable soup spread through the kitchen, I realized I needed to act. I couldn't just wait for Barbara's next move. The dignity I had reclaimed also demanded courage, and for the first time, I thought about going back to the notary office myself to legally reinforce my decision. Before going to bed, I opened the window and let the cold air of the early morning in. The wind brought with it the distant sound of the River Thames and the rustle of the trees. I took a deep breath, feeling my chest burn, but also expand. It was no longer just about apartments. It was about the life I still had left to live. I leaned my forehead against the cold glass and promised myself, I will never again let them laugh at me with impunity. From that moment on, I would own not only the properties, but my own voice. The next day, I woke up with a sense of purpose. The strong smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen, and for the first time in a long time, every sip seemed to give me the strength to go on. I put on a simple gray dress, tied a blue scarf on my head, and took the folder of documents. Ethan insisted on accompanying me, and I didn't refuse. We walked through the narrow streets of London, the sound of the loose cobblestones under our feet mixing with the murmur of people crowding in the bakeries. The cold wind cut across my face, but there was a new warmth inside me, a determination I hadn't felt since the years I struggled to pay the bills alone. At the notary office, the atmosphere was again silent, with the smell of polished wood and stored paper. The same lawyer received me, and seeing my serious expression, he adjusted his glasses without asking any questions. I want to ensure that everything is bulletproof against any challenge, I said firmly. He explained the legal possibilities, such as registering a living will, specifying exactly who would have access and who would not. Ethan listened attentively, his forehead furrowed, as if absorbing every detail. As the lawyer spoke, I remembered Holly's mocking smile and Barbara's threats, and I felt that every registered word would be a line sewn against disrespect. I signed the necessary documents with the same calmness of someone finishing a meticulous job. The pen slipped across the paper, but my hand was steady. In the end, the lawyer looked me in the eyes and said, "Now, Mrs. Miller, your will is guaranteed by law." Those words sounded like music. It wasn't just about assets. It was about respect, about transforming the wound of humiliation into armor. I left there feeling lighter, although I knew that Barbara's reaction would be immediate and violent. Indeed, it didn't take long. That afternoon, when I returned home, I found a note slipped under the door. The paper smelled of cheap perfume, and the handwriting was Holly's. "Grandma, we need to talk. Mom is beside herself, but we can work it out. Think about us." I tore the paper into and let them fall into the trash can. The sound of the pieces letting go was, for me, like the closing of a zipper, a sealed decision. There would be no turning back. At night, the phone rang again. I hesitated before answering, but Ethan insisted I do it. It was Barbara, her voice lower but full of rancor. "So that's it? You're going to cut me out for good? You're going to pretend I was never your daughter?" The question came loaded with theatricality, but behind it was an almost palpable despair. I replied calmly, my heart racing. "Daughter, I never wanted to exclude you from my life, but you excluded yourself when you chose to laugh at my poverty. Now, I'm just protecting what's mine." On the other side, a heavy silence, then a dry click. She hung up. I stood by the window, looking at the yellowish lights reflected on the wet cobblestones of the street. The distant sound of the Thames hitting the banks came softly, like a reminder that life went on, despite the war inside the house. I thought about how much I had endured in silence for years and how now every word I said seemed to have a weight it never had before. It was as if old age, instead of weakening me, had given me the courage to no longer look down. Ethan approached, placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "Grandma, I'm with you in everything. If she tries anything, we'll face it together." The warmth of that firm hand brought tears to my eyes, but tears of relief, not sadness. I hugged him tightly, feeling the smell of his clothes still damp from the rain, and thought that, deep down, this inheritance wasn't just about bricks and walls. It was the chance to ensure that Ethan would never go through the humiliation I went through. Before going to bed, I sat in front of the sewing machine once more. I ran my hand over the cold pedal, remembering how many times I had fixed pieces for Barbara without hearing even a thank you. The humming of the pedal still seemed to echo in my mind, but now it was different. It wasn't the sound of submission, it was the sound of resistance. I closed my eyes and realized that, for the first time in many years, I was sewing not a dress, but my own freedom. The following days were marked by a strange calm, but I knew it was just the silence before the storm. The morning still began with the smell of strong coffee and the clinking of teacups in the kitchen, but there was something in the air that betrayed the climate of threat. Every time the phone rang or someone knocked on the gate, my heart raced, as if expecting Barbara's next attack. The neighbors, discreet, were already whispering in the hallways. I felt their curious looks when I went to the bakery to buy bread, as if everyone already knew about the inheritance and were waiting to see how the drama would unfold. One afternoon, while watering the plants in the backyard, I heard the muffled sound of two neighbors talking behind the wall. They say the daughter is furious, that she's going to sue her own mother. The other replied, almost whispering, "It's always like this. When money gets involved, family tears itself apart." I pretended not to hear, but the words weighed on me. The smell of wet earth, which used to calm me, now brought only the bitter memory that my dignity had become public gossip. 2 days later, the confirmation arrived. I received a court summons delivered by a bailiff, a serious man with a low voice. The paper smelled of fresh ink and carried in cold. Letters, the threat I had already imagined. Barbara was trying to challenge the inheritance. Ethan read it aloud, his eyes flashing with indignation. "This is absurd, Grandma. She has no right." I nodded in silence, but inside I felt a pang of pain. Not for the dispute, but for realizing how far my daughter was willing to go just to hurt me. That night, the house seemed bigger and colder than ever. The wind beat against the windows, bringing a constant whistle that kept me from sleeping. I walked barefoot through the living room, hearing the wooden floorboards creak, and thought about all the times I sewed clothes for Barbara when she was a child, mending them so she wouldn't be embarrassed at school. I remembered the nights she slept peacefully while I sewed until my fingers bled, and now she was treating me like an enemy. The lump in my throat almost suffocated me. Ethan, noticing my state, insisted on acting. "Grandma, let's get ahead of them. I want you to come with me to the lawyer. Will respond in kind." I hesitated, afraid of prolonging the conflict even more, but the firmness in his eyes convinced me. The next day, we went together to the office recommended by a friend of his. The smell of new paper and the leather of the chairs mixed with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee made me feel as if I were in another world. The lawyer, a man with a calm way of speaking, explained that Barbara's case had no legal basis, but that it was important to show strength from the beginning. I signed more documents, this time with the full awareness that I was arming my defense. Each signature seemed like a firm stitch in a thick fabric, impossible to tear. The lawyer spoke about deadlines, about formal responses, and Ethan wrote everything down carefully. I just watched, trying to stay upright, even with the invisible weight I was carrying on my shoulders. When we left there, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. It was necessary, but I never imagined that one day I would be face to face with my own daughter in a courtroom. That same late afternoon, on returning home, I found an anonymous letter, handwritten in the mailbox. The paper smelled of cigarette smoke, and the letters were shaky. "Mrs. Miller, be careful. They're saying you won't be able to handle the pressure. Don't be fooled." I read it several times, trying to identify the handwriting, but nothing seemed familiar. I put the letter in the desk drawer as if keeping a secret proof that there were more people hoping I would give in. I sat in the armchair, exhausted, and let the silence of the night spread through the living room. The church bell rang in the distance, marking 9 o'clock, and each chime seemed like a warning that time was running out fast. The smell of lavender from my room reached the living room, bringing a memory of calm, but not enough. I looked at Ethan, who was watching me in silence, and said, "They can try to bring me down, but they won't succeed. I've already lost too much to still lose myself." He smiled, his eyes welling up, and at that instant I realized that, despite the war, I wasn't alone. The weeks that followed the hearing were as heavy as lead. I tried to maintain my routine, prepare my coffee in the morning, listen to the church bell at the right times, sow small orders for the neighbors. But inside there was a constant tremor. Every sound from the gate made me think it would be another summons, another blow from Barbara. Ethan visited me every day, bringing news of the process, and the simple sound of his voice gave me strength. Still, the pain of being accused by my own daughter wouldn't leave me. It was like a bad perfume that permeates and doesn't disappear. One afternoon, returning from the market with a bag of vegetables, I found Barbara leaning against my gate. Her face was marked by haste and anger, and the strong smell of cigarette smoke she carried permeated the air. "We need to talk," she said, without asking permission. I held the bag tightly, the weight of the tomatoes and potatoes straining my fingers, and replied coldly, "This is not the place for a conversation." But she insisted, her eyes flashing. "Are you really going to let the neighbors talk about you suing your own daughter? Are you going to prefer public shame?" That statement was like a punch. It wasn't enough to try to take what was mine. Now she was using the weapon of social scandal. I took a deep breath, the smell of earth, from the vegetables mixing with the cigarette smoke, and replied calmly, "The shame isn't mine, Barbara. It's yours for wanting to take from your own mother what she earned." She clenched her fists but said nothing else. She left in a hurry, her heels hitting the pavement like hammers. I stood there with the heavy bag, but with a lighter chest for finally having said what I needed to. That night, Ethan came to have dinner with me. I made a kale soup, the strong smell of the broth filling the kitchen. I told him about the encounter with Barbara, and his eyes filled with anger. "Grandma, she's desperate because she knows she's lost. But be careful, she'll try something else." I nodded, stirring the soup in the pot slowly, the steam rising and moistening my glasses. Deep down, I knew he was right. Barbara wouldn't accept defeat silently, and she really didn't. 2 days later, I found a note glued to the church door, written in large letters. Eleanor Miller turned her back on her own daughter. The paper smelled of cheap glue, and the still fresh ink smudged my fingers when I tore it off. My stomach churned. It was Barbara trying to tarnish my name in the community, using the cruelest weapon, public gossip. The ladies coming out of Mass whispered, and I knew the seed of doubt was already being planted. I returned home with my head down, but there I found an unexpected gift. Mrs. Peterson, my neighbor, had left a still warm, homemade loaf of bread on the doorstep. Delicious smell of the freshly baked dough brought a smile to my face. There was also a short note. "Don't pay attention to their wickedness, Eleanor. Those who know you know the truth." I held the paper with trembling hands and cried in silence. Not everyone was against me, and that simple support was more valuable than any deed of ownership. The following week, another hearing was scheduled. The courtroom was full again, the air permeated with dust and disinfectant. Barbara seemed even harder, with elegant clothes and a steel gaze, but something in her was beginning to show wear, the tiredness in her eyes, the less confident tone of her voice. Holly, beside her, seemed restless, fidgeting in her chair, avoiding looking me directly in the eye. When it was my turn to speak, I calmly told them about the years of struggle, the nights of sewing, and how I had always lived with dignity. My voice came out choked, but it didn't waver. The silence in the courtroom was so profound that you could hear the creak of the clerk's pen writing. On the way out, the strong London sun blinded my eyes. I felt the heat on my face and the smell of roasted chestnuts invade the air again. Ethan hugged me tightly, almost lifting me off the ground. Grandma, today was different. They heard you, they really heard you. I smiled, with tears still streaming, and I realized that, regardless of the judge's final decision, I had already regained something no one could take from me, my own voice. Days after that hearing, I woke up to the persistent sound of the doorbell. The sun had barely risen and the weak light was coming through the window. I opened the door with a racing heart and found Holly alone, her eyes swollen from crying. The sweet perfume she always wore now seemed sickly, mixed with the smell of cigarette smoke ingrained in her jacket. "Grandma, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice choked. I hesitated for a moment, but ended up letting her in. The living room felt small with the heavy silence that enveloped us. Holly sat in the armchair, her hands nervously fidgeting with her phone, but without the courage to look at me. "Mom is out of her mind. She talks about not stopping until you give in, but I don't know if I want to continue with this." Her tone was hesitant, as if she were trying to gauge my reactions. I watched her in silence, remembering when she was a child and would run through my kitchen asking for fritters. The contrast between that girl and the young woman in front of me, lost between her mother's ambition and her own conscience, tightened my chest. "Why did you come here, Holly?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. She lowered her eyes and replied, "Because I saw how you spoke in court.